The small, sleepy town of Millstone was the kind of place where the streets emptied after sunset, leaving only the sound of crickets and the faint hum of streetlights. Its charm lay in its simplicity, but for Officer Brad Turner, the quiet was a constant reminder of how insignificant his job felt. With no major crimes or high-profile incidents, Brad often found himself patrolling the same deserted roads, his mind a cauldron of frustration and unchallenged prejudices. Brad leaned back in his patrol car, parked strategically outside Millstone's only 24-hour convenience store. His eyes, hidden behind mirrored sunglasses despite the dim evening light, scanned every movement around the store. He thrived on suspicion. After all, he told himself it was his job to notice the details everyone else missed. In his mind, he was Millstone's first line of defense, the only thing standing between order and chaos. Inside the store, Sheriff Renee Hayes moved with a purposeful grace. She had just wrapped up a grueling 14-hour shift, covering for an understaffed department. Despite her fatigue, her posture was upright, her expression calm. Dressed in simple jeans and a fitted jacket, Renee looked like any other resident stopping for late-night essentials. Her badge, tucked away in her pocket, was not on display after all. She was off duty. Renee had grown up in Millstone, and though she had seen more of the world during her time in the State Police Academy and subsequent postings, she returned to her hometown with the mission to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community it served. She was aware of the challenges. Being a black woman in a leadership role within a predominantly white town wasn't easy, but Renee had learned to navigate the undercurrents of skepticism and outright resistance with professionalism and unwavering resolve. The faint chime of the doorbell echoed as Renee entered the store. She gave a polite nod to the cashier, an older man named Marty, who had known her since she was a teenager. Marty grinned in return, his leathery face crinkling. "Evening, Sheriff," he said, his voice tinged with genuine warmth. "Long shift." "You know it," Renee replied with a tired smile. "Just grabbing a few things and heading home." She wandered through the aisles, her eyes scanning for her usual groceries, some milk, a loaf of bread, and a few snacks to tide her over until she could make it to the proper grocery store. Her movements were unhurried, but years of training had conditioned her to remain aware of her surroundings. It wasn't paranoia, just prudence. And tonight, her instincts told her she was being watched. Outside, Brad's gaze narrowed as he observed Renee. He didn't recognize her immediately. From his perspective, she was just another late-night customer, except to Brad, she wasn't just anything. Her dark skin, confident stride, and apparent ease in a neighborhood Brad considered his to protect immediately triggered a familiar narrative in his mind. "Out-of-towner," he muttered to himself, fingers drumming on the steering wheel. "Bet she's up to something." As Renee approached the counter to pay, Marty rang up her items with the same friendly demeanor. The exchange was brief and uneventful. Renee thanked him and headed for the door, her small bag of groceries swinging in her hand. She glanced once at the patrol car outside, her sharp eyes catching the glint of Brad's sunglasses even in the fading light. She didn't recognize him, but she recognized the tension in his posture. She had encountered it too many times before. As she stepped outside, the cool night air greeted her. Renee adjusted her grip on the bag and headed toward her car, parked a few spaces away. Brad was out of his patrol car in seconds. The sound of the car door slamming broke the stillness of the night, and heavy boots crunched against the asphalt as he approached her. "Mom," Brad called out, his voice carrying an edge that was neither welcoming nor professional. "Hold up a second." Renee stopped mid-step, her instincts flaring. She turned slowly, her expression neutral. "Yes, officer." Brad's eyes flicked to the bag in her hand, then back to her face. He stepped closer, his chest puffed out. "What were you doing in the store just now?" Renee blinked, her eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise. "Buying groceries," she said, holding up the bag. Her voice was calm but firm. "Is there a problem?" "Got a lot of thefts in this area," Brad said, his tone laced with insinuation. "I need to see what's in the bag." Renee's eyes locked onto his, her jaw tightening imperceptibly. She had encountered officers like Brad before, men who wore their authority like a weapon, ready to wield it against anyone they deemed unworthy of respect. Still, she kept her composure. "Are you accusing me of stealing, officer?" Brad's lips curled into a smirk. "Just doing my job, ma, am. Let's take a look." Renee exhaled slowly, her patience thinning. She placed the bag on the hood of her car and stepped back, crossing her arms. Brad rifled through it, his movements quick and unnecessarily rough. A loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a package of granola bars, nothing out of the ordinary. When he didn't find anything suspicious, Brad's irritation mounted. He straightened, his eyes narrowing at her. "Mind showing me some ID?" Renee's brows furrowed. "Is there a reason for this stop, officer?" Brad's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially by someone who didn't shrink under his authority. "Just routine," he said, his voice hardening. "Hand it over." "Why?" Renee reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out her wallet. She flipped it open, revealing not just her driver's license, but also her sheriff's badge. The metallic sheen caught the light, its significance unmistakable. Brad's expression froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He hadn't expected this. "Sheriff Hayes," he said slowly, reading the name off the badge. "You work around here." "I am the sheriff of this county," Renee said evenly, her gaze unwavering. "And you still haven't answered my question. What is the reason for this stop?" Brad's face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and anger flooding his features. He squared his shoulders, his pride unwilling to let him back down. "Just being thorough, Sheriff," he said, his tone defensive. "Can't be too careful these days." Renee's jaw clenched. She could feel the weight of his ego pressing against the situation, threatening to escalate it further. She decided to de-escalate for now. "Well, officer," she said, tucking her wallet away, "I suggest you brush up on your protocol. Stopping someone without cause is not being thorough, it's harassment." Brad stiffened, his jaw working as he struggled to come up with a retort. Before he could speak, Renee stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "And for the record," she said, her voice low but firm, "your badge doesn't give you the right to disrespect the people you're supposed to serve, including me." With that, she turned on her heel and walked to her car, her head held high. Brad stood frozen, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. The night air felt heavier now, and the distant hum of crickets seemed louder in the charged silence. As Renee drove away, her thoughts were a mix of frustration and resolve. This wasn't the first time she had faced someone like Brad, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But she also knew that every confrontation was an opportunity to challenge, to educate, and if necessary, to stand her ground. For Brad, however, the encounter was far from over. His bruised ego and simmering anger would push him to make decisions that would soon come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't imagine. Brad paced the parking lot in front of the convenience store, his boots scuffing against the cracked asphalt. The cool night air, usually a balm to his frayed nerves, felt stifling as his thoughts churned. The encounter with Sheriff Renee Hayes had left him feeling humiliated and enraged. He had been caught off guard, his authority questioned in front of witnesses. For a man like Brad, who thrived on control, the exchange had struck a deep blow to his pride. Inside his patrol car, Brad sat slumped in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly. His radio crackled with mundane dispatch updates, but he ignored them, his mind replaying the confrontation. "She thought she could humiliate me," he thought bitterly, his jaw tightening. He reached for the radio mic and clicked it on. "Dispatch, this is Officer Turner," he said, his voice flat but laced with tension. "Go ahead, Turner," the dispatcher replied. "I need you to run a plate for me." "Could be suspicious activity," Brad said, glancing at the notes he had hastily scribbled. "Out-of-town plates, black SUV. License number Bravo 126 Delta Niner." There was a brief pause before the dispatcher responded. "Copy that. Stand by." Brad drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his knee bouncing with impatience. The CV had belonged to Renee, and while he knew it was unlikely to yield anything of significance, Brad was determined to justify his actions. He couldn't let her walk away unchallenged, not after the way she had made him feel. Minutes passed before the dispatcher's voice returned. "Turner, the vehicle is registered to Renee Hayes. Address matches the sheriff's department in Millstone. No outstanding issues on the vehicle." Brad's lips curled into a sneer. Figures, he muttered under his breath, clicking the mic off. The logical part of his brain told him to let it go. She was the sheriff. Pursuing this any further would only dig a deeper hole. but the sting of humiliation was too fresh, his bruised ego demanding retribution. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. He didn't know exactly what he was planning to do, but he was certain of one thing: he wasn't letting her get the last word. Renee, meanwhile, drove through the quiet streets of Millstone, her thoughts a mix of exhaustion and frustration. Encounters like the one she'd just endured were not new to her, but they never failed to sap her energy. It was a constant reminder of the systemic challenges she faced, even within her own profession. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Marty, the cashier at the convenience store. Everything okay? That officer didn't seem right. Renee smiled faintly at the gesture but sighed as she typed a response. Thanks, Marty. All good. Just another day. She stepped out of the SUV and grabbed her bag of groceries. Her home, a modest but well-kept bungalow on the outskirts of town, was her sanctuary. Yet even as she unlocked the door, a nagging feeling lingered. The way Brad had looked at her, the hostility in his tone, it wasn't over. Renee's instincts were proven right moments later when headlights swept across her living room window. She frowned, setting the groceries on the kitchen counter. Through the curtains, she could see the unmistakable silhouette of a police cruiser pulling into her driveway. What now? She muttered, irritation flaring. The knock at the door was sharp and insistent. Renee took a deep breath, smoothing her jacket as she walked to the door. Opening it, she found Brad standing on her porch, his hand resting on his belt, posture rigid. Officer Turner, Renee said, her voice cool. Can I help you? Brad's expression was unreadable, but his stance radiated tension. Sheriff Hayes, he began, his tone clipped. I need to ask you a few more questions. Renee's eyes narrowed slightly. About what, officer? I thought we settled everything back at the store. Brad hesitated, his confidence faltering under her steady gaze. I received a report about some suspicious activity involving a vehicle matching your description. He lied. I need to verify a few details. Renee crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. Suspicious activity, she repeated, her tone skeptical. Are you sure you're not just making excuses to harass me? Brad's jaw clenched, but he forced a smirk. I'm just doing my job, Sheriff. I need to take a look at your vehicle again. Routine check. Renee stared at him for a long moment, the silence between them heavy. Then, with a sigh, she stepped aside. Fine. Let's get this over with. Brad's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he followed her to the driveway. As he began his inspection, Renee watched him carefully, her arms still crossed. She could see his movements were more about theater than actual investigation, a show of dominance rather than genuine procedure. When Brad found nothing amiss, his frustration grew palpable. Everything seems fine, he admitted begrudgingly, stepping back from the SUV. Renee took a step closer, her voice calm but firm. Officer Turner, let me give you a piece of advice. If you're going to target someone, make sure you have something to back it up. Because right now, all I see is a man who's wasting both our time. Brad's face burned, the weight of her words cutting through his bravado. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his cruiser, slamming the door as he drove off into the night. As Renee watched his taillights disappear, she felt a flicker of unease. This wasn't just about her. Brad's behavior was a symptom of something much larger, a problem that, sooner or later, would need to be confronted. The next day in Millstone began like any other, the town waking slowly under a pale morning sun. Residents shuffled to the diner for their usual coffee and gossip, while kids raced each other to the bus stop. Renee Hayes, still carrying the frustration of the previous night's events, prepared for her day at the sheriff's office. She knew her position came with challenges, but the previous night's encounter with Officer Turner had shaken her in ways she didn't expect. She arrived at the station early, her SUV parked neatly in its usual spot. The weight of responsibility pressed against her shoulders as she reviewed her day's tasks, a few community meetings, paperwork, and a scheduled safety briefing with the local police department, one that would include Brad Turner. Renee smirked humorlessly at the irony. She would have to address the incident, but tactfully. The last thing she wanted was to escalate tensions further. Meanwhile, Brad was on patrol again, his bitterness from the previous night still simmering. He had spent hours brooding over their confrontation, replaying it in his mind like a broken record. In his version of events, he had been the victim of an unjust humiliation. He needed to reassert himself to remind everyone, including Sheriff Hayes, of his authority. As he drove through town, his eyes caught a familiar black SUV parked outside the community center. Renee was inside, attending a meeting with several city officials. Brad pulled over, his heart pounding with a toxic mix of anger and anticipation. She thinks she's untouchable, he thought, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Let's see about that. Brad's opportunity came when Renee exited the community center an hour later. She carried herself with the same calm confidence as the night before, her head held high as she walked toward her vehicle. A few community members loitered nearby, exchanging greetings with her as she passed. Brad saw his moment. Stepping out of his patrol car, he called out loudly, "Sheriff Hayes, I need a word." Renee turned, her brow furrowing slightly as she spotted Brad. The casual smiles of the onlookers faded, replaced by curiosity tinged with unease. It wasn't often that two law enforcement officers confronted each other in public, and the scene quickly began to draw attention. "What is it now, Officer Turner?" Renee asked, her tone measured but weary. Brad approached, his voice louder than necessary. "I received another report about suspicious activity involving your vehicle. I'm going to need you to step aside while I take a look." Renee's expression hardened. "Suspicious activity," she repeated, her voice cutting through the growing murmurs of the small crowd. "Are you seriously doing this again?" "It's standard procedure," Brad shot back, his tone defensive but forceful. "I'm just following up." Renee could see the fire in his eyes, the need to save face in front of the onlookers. She knew better than to escalate the situation, but the blatant targeting had to stop. "If this is about last night, officer, you're skating dangerously close to harassment," she said firmly. "And I suggest you think carefully about your next move." Brad smirked, ignoring the warning. "You don't get special treatment just because of your badge, Sheriff. Let me do my job." The crowd around them began to grow, with smartphones now held aloft, recording every word. Some whispered to one another, speculating about what was happening. Renee scanned the faces, recognizing that this was no longer just about her and Brad, it was becoming a public spectacle. She sighed and stepped aside. "Fine. Do what you have to do," she said, her tone clipped. "But you won't find anything." Brad wasted no time. He marched to her SUV, opening the door and rifling through the interior with exaggerated zeal. The crowd murmured in disapproval, some shaking their heads at the blatant overreach. Renee stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of calm as she watched him. Minutes passed, and as expected, Brad found nothing. He slammed the door shut, his face flushed with frustration. "You're clear," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Renee stepped forward, her voice carrying authority that silenced the murmurs around them. "Officer Turner, I hope this is the last time you feel the need to misuse your position like this," she said. "Because the next time it won't just be me calling you out, it'll be your superiors." Brad stiffened, his pride battered by her words and the silent judgment of the crowd. Without another word, he stormed back to his patrol car and drove off, the sound of his tires screeching on the asphalt lingering in the air. As the crowd dispersed, a local journalist who had been present approached Renee. "Sheriff Hayes, care to comment?" she asked, holding up her phone. Renee shook her head, offering a polite but firm response. "I'll let the facts speak for themselves." Inside, though, Renee's resolve was steeling. The incident wasn't just an attack on her, it was a symptom of a deeper issue within the system she had sworn to uphold. It was time to confront it, no matter the cost. The public confrontation between Officer Brad Turner and Sheriff Renee Hayes quickly became the talk of Millstone. By mid-afternoon, videos of the encounter were circulating online, drawing widespread attention from the community and beyond. The footage was damning, showing Brad's overly aggressive behavior and Renee's composed responses. The town was abuzz with debates, opinions ranging from support for Renee's dignity to criticism of Brad's apparent misuse of authority. Renee sat in her office at the sheriff's station, her phone buzzing with messages from colleagues and friends who had seen the video. She resisted the urge to engage with the chatter, instead focusing on her next steps. The incident was no longer just about her, it had become a flashpoint in the community, a mirror reflecting deeper issues of prejudice and abuse of power. A knock at her door broke her concentration. It was Deputy Mark Johnson, one of her most reliable officers. His usually calm demeanor was tinged with urgency. "Sheriff, you need to see this," Mark said, holding up his tablet. "The state police just shared an alert. It involves Brad Turner." Renee's brow furrowed as she took the tablet. On the screen was a notice about a counterfeit money investigation tied to a network of local businesses. The counterfeit bills were high quality and had been circulating in the area for weeks, creating problems for shop owners and law enforcement alike. What caught Renee's attention, however, was a key detail: several transactions involving the counterfeit bills had been linked to Brad Turner's credit card and patrol routes. "What's the connection?" Renee asked, leaning forward. "It's not definitive yet," Mark replied, "but the state task force has flagged him as a person of interest. There's a pattern: they can't ignore transactions at convenience stores, small purchases and cash-heavy businesses, all overlapping with his shifts." Renee's mind raced. Brad's actions had seemed personal, fueled by ego and prejudice. But now there was the possibility of something far more sinister, a reason for his overzealous behavior beyond simple arrogance. As they spoke, a call came through the station radio. "Sheriff Hayes, we've got a situation at the main intersection by the courthouse. State police are on scene." Renee grabbed her jacket. "Let's go," she told Mark. When Renee arrived at the scene, she saw two state police vehicles parked in front of a familiar sight: Brad Turner's patrol car. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring as state officers spoke with Brad, who looked visibly agitated. Renee approached, her badge displayed prominently. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone calm but authoritative. One of the state officers, Agent Elena Cruz, stepped forward. "Sheriff Hayes, we're conducting an investigation into the counterfeit currency case. Officer Turner is being detained for questioning." Brad's face turned red as he pointed at Renee. "This is a setup," he barked. "She's trying to ruin me." Renee raised an eyebrow but remained composed. "I wasn't aware of this investigation until 5 minutes ago," she said evenly. "But if you've got nothing to hide, Officer Turner, you should have no problem cooperating." Brad's protests grew louder, but Agent Cruz cut him off. "We've traced multiple counterfeit transactions to locations on your patrol route, officer. Until we clear this up, we need your full cooperation." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the state officers placed Brad in handcuffs. The symbolism was not lost on anyone: an officer who had misused his authority now being subjected to it. As Brad was escorted to the state vehicle, his eyes locked on Renee. "This isn't over," he hissed, venom dripping from his words. Renee met his gaze with quiet resolve. "You're right," she said softly. "It's not." Back at the sheriff's station, Renee felt the weight of the day settle on her. She knew this incident would have ripple effects, not just for Brad but for the department and the community. While she didn't relish seeing a fellow officer in handcuffs, she couldn't ignore the justice in the moment. Later that evening, Renee sat down to write a statement for the community. It was time to address what had happened, not just the public confrontation but the broader issues it represented. She typed deliberately, choosing her words with care. "To the citizens of Millstone. Recent events have highlighted challenges within our law enforcement community. As your sheriff, I am committed to transparency, accountability, and justice. No one is above the law, including those who enforce it. This is a time for reflection and change, and I invite all of you to be part of the conversation as we work toward building trust and equity within our community." As she read over the words, she felt a sense of resolve. This wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a larger reckoning. The actions of one officer had exposed systemic issues, and Renee was determined to ensure that this moment became a turning point, not just a fleeting controversy. The fallout from Officer Brad Turner's public arrest was swift and far-reaching. By the next morning, the video of his altercation with Sheriff Renee Hayes had gone viral, drawing widespread criticism of his behavior. Social media buzzed with hashtags demanding accountability and reform, and even local news stations picked up the story, framing it as an example of unchecked bias within law enforcement. At the sheriff's station, Renee stood in front of her team during their morning briefing. The air was thick with tension as deputies and staff exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone was aware of the elephant in the room. "Before we dive into today's agenda," Renee began, her tone calm but firm, "I want to address the situation involving Officer Turner." The room fell silent. Every set of eyes focused on her. "First, I want to make it clear that accountability is not a one-way street," Renee continued. "It applies to every member of law enforcement, regardless of rank or title. As public servants, we must hold ourselves to the highest standards. The events of the past few days have shown us that when those standards are not met, it reflects poorly on all of us." A murmur rippled through the room. Renee raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "I also want to acknowledge the frustration and hurt that incidents like these cause, not just for the people directly involved, but for our community as a whole. If we are to rebuild trust, we must confront these challenges head-on. That means taking a hard look at how we operate and being willing to make changes where they are needed." Deputy Mark Johnson raised his hand. "Sheriff, do you think this will affect how the community views us moving forward?" Renee nodded. "It already has, Mark. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes discomfort is what pushes us to grow. Our job now is to show our community that we're listening and that we're committed to doing better." As the briefing ended, Renee felt a glimmer of hope. While the path ahead would be challenging, she believed her team could rise to the occasion if they approached it with humility and determination. Meanwhile, Brad Turner's world was unraveling. Detained and suspended without pay, he found himself isolated and under scrutiny. His initial bravado had evaporated, replaced by simmering anger and resentment. As he sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the news coverage of his arrest, he couldn't escape the stark reality he had been brought down by his own actions. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some from friends offering support, others from people he barely knew, either condemning or defending him. His former allies on the force were silent, distancing themselves from the scandal. In the silence, Brad replayed the events in his mind. The moments when his temper had flared, when his ego had overpowered his better judgment. Deep down, he began to see that his actions were indefensible. Yet, acknowledging that truth came with a bitter sting. At the same time, the community was mobilizing. Renee's statement had sparked a larger conversation about bias and accountability in Millstone's law enforcement. A town hall meeting was scheduled to give residents a platform to voice their concerns and propose solutions. The meeting, held in the community center, drew a larger crowd than expected. Renee sat at the front of the room, flanked by members of her team and representatives from the state police. She listened intently as residents shared their experiences, some expressing frustration with law enforcement, others calling for greater collaboration. One speaker, an older black man named Mr. Carter, stood and addressed the room with quiet authority. "I've lived in Millstone for 50 years, he said, his voice steady. "And I've seen a lot of changes, good and bad. But what happened last week wasn't just about one bad officer. It's about a system that allows those attitudes to go unchecked. We need to hold people accountable, yes. But we also need to create a culture where this kind of behavior doesn't happen in the first place." His words were met with nods of agreement. Renee felt a surge of gratitude for the community's willingness to engage in such an honest dialogue. When the meeting ended, she stayed behind, talking to residents one-on-one and answering their questions. By the time she left, she felt both exhausted and invigorated. The road ahead would be long, but the foundation for change was being laid. The next day, Renee received an email from the state police commissioner. It contained a simple but powerful message: "Your leadership is making waves, Sheriff Hayes. Keep pushing for what's right." Renee sat back in her chair, letting the words sink in. She thought about the choices that had led her to this moment, the challenges, the setbacks, and the small victories along the way. She knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity and purpose. Brad Turner's actions had exposed deep flaws within the system, but they had also created an opportunity for growth. Now it was up to her and the community to seize that opportunity and ensure that the lessons of the past week would lead to a better future for Millstone. A month had passed since Officer Brad Turner's arrest, and the atmosphere in Millstone had shifted. The town, once quiet and predictable, had become a hub of activity and conversation about accountability and reform. Sheriff Renee Hayes found herself at the center of it all, balancing the demands of her job with the growing expectations of a community yearning for change. The town hall meeting had been just the beginning. Renee had formed a task force to address systemic issues in the department, inviting community leaders, activists, and law enforcement officers to collaborate. The meetings were long and often heated, but they were productive. For the first time, residents felt they had a voice in shaping how their town was policed. Meanwhile, Brad Turner sat in the dimly lit office of a mandatory counselor. His suspension had been extended indefinitely, and part of the department's conditions for reconsidering his employment was that he attend regular counseling sessions to confront his biases and behavior. It was a humiliating requirement for a man who had once prided himself on his perceived authority, but it was also the only lifeline he had left. The counselor, a middle-aged black woman named Dr. Angela Reed, looked at Brad with a mixture of empathy and firmness. "You've spent most of these sessions deflecting," she said, her voice steady. "But we can't make progress unless you're willing to be honest with yourself." Brad leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed defensively. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. Renee made it personal. Dr. Reed raised an eyebrow. "Did she? Or did you?" Brad's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Dr. Reed leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Brad, what do you think justice looks like?" The question caught him off guard. He shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing for an answer. "It's following the law," he said hesitantly, "making sure people do what they're supposed to." Dr. Reed shook her head gently. "That's compliance, not justice. Justice is about fairness, equity, and respect. It's about recognizing the humanity in others, even when it challenges your own perspective." Her words lingered with Brad long after the session ended. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider that his actions hadn't just been about enforcing the law, they had been about asserting power, about feeding an insecurity he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The realization was uncomfortable, but it was also a turning point. At the sheriff's station, Renee reviewed the latest proposals from the task force. They included recommendations for improved training on implicit bias, increased community oversight, and policies to ensure accountability within the department. The changes were ambitious, but Renee was determined to see them through. That afternoon, she visited a local community center where a group of young people had gathered for a workshop on law enforcement and civic responsibility. The room buzzed with energy as teenagers discussed their hopes and frustrations. Renee listened intently, then stood to address the group. "I became a sheriff because I wanted to make a difference," she began. "But I've learned that real change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when people like you hold leaders like me accountable. It happens when we work together to create a system that serves everyone." A young girl raised her hand. "Do you think things will really change?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. Renee nodded. "I do. But it won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. Change takes persistence, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But I believe in this community, and I believe in all of you." The room erupted into applause, and Renee felt a renewed sense of purpose. These young people represented the future, and she was determined to give them a foundation they could build on. Weeks later, Brad stood outside the sheriff's station, a folder of paperwork in hand. His counseling sessions had ended, and he had been invited to reapply for his position under strict conditions. The task force's reforms were already in place, meaning he would face a probationary period and ongoing evaluations if reinstated. As he entered the station, he felt the weight of every eye on him. His former colleagues were cordial but distant, their smiles tinged with discomfort. Brad couldn't blame them. He had tarnished his own reputation, and rebuilding trust would be an uphill battle. Renee greeted him in her office, her expression neutral but professional. "Brad," she said, gesturing for him to sit, "I've reviewed your application. The decision isn't entirely up to me, but I wanted to have this conversation face to face." Brad nodded, his palms sweating. "I understand, Sheriff." Renee leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk. "You've completed the required steps, but this isn't just about ticking boxes. Rejoining this department means committing to the values we're trying to uphold: integrity, accountability, and service to the community. If you can't meet those expectations, this isn't the place for you." Brad met her gaze, his voice quiet but sincere. "I've made mistakes, Sheriff. I let my pride and biases get in the way of doing my job. I'm not proud of what I did, but I want to make it right. If you give me a chance, I'll prove that I can." Renee studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. This isn't about second chances, Brad. It's about doing the work. If you're serious, we'll see where this goes. But know this, you'll be held to the same standard as everyone else, no exceptions. Brad exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Thank you, Sheriff, I won't let you down. The weeks that followed were a test for both Brad and the department. Under Renee's leadership, the reforms began to take root. Officers attended workshops on cultural competency, and community policing initiatives strengthened relationships between law enforcement and residents. Brad threw himself into the work, determined to prove that he could change. Slowly, he began to earn back the trust of his peers and the community. One evening, during a community outreach event, Brad found himself face to face with Mr. Carter, the man who had spoken so passionately at the town hall meeting. Officer Turner, Mr. Carter said, his tone measured. I see you've been making an effort. Brad nodded. I'm trying, sir. I know I have a lot to make up for. Mr. Carter studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. Good, keep at it. Words are easy, but actions show who you really are. Brad shook his hand, gratitude and determination swelling in his chest. Months later, the town gathered for an outdoor rally celebrating the progress that had been made. Renee stood at the podium, her voice ringing out over the crowd. Today we celebrate not just the changes we've made, but the commitment we've shown to each other. Millstone is proof that when we come together, we can overcome even the deepest divides. But this is only the beginning. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey, and we must keep moving forward. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the square. Among them stood Brad, no longer the man he had been, but someone who was beginning to understand the true meaning of service and justice. As the sun set over Millstone, the town glowed with a sense of hope and renewal. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were on the right path together.